Okay, good evening, everyone. We are the group 5, and we are going to discuss the chapter 5, which is all about typical and atypical development among children. So, have you ever wondered how children develop? Perhaps you have compared your own development to that of a sibling or cousin of yours, right? So, if this is the case, you are likely interested in child development, which is the pattern of growth, change, and stability that occurs from conception to adolescence. So, by the way, at the end of this chapter, you will be able to identify typical and atypical development of children in the various stage of child development. To further discuss more, let me introduce first the five topics under this chapter. First topics, the child development and its importance. Second is child development theories. Third is the typical and atypical development. Fourth topic is the domains of development, and the last topic is stages in development. Every child is a different kind of flower, and all together make this world a beautiful garden. So this quotes that I firmly believe that this applies to all children, but it has a special significance for parents of kids who have a range of disabilities and health issues. Gardening is both a science and an art. While some flowers prefer the darkness, others requires a lot of sunlight. Some flowers are tough and durable and require minimal maintenance, while others require regular watering as well as picking and pruning. Flowers come in a variety of colors, saturations, and vibrancies, representing every color of the rainbow. While some plants are delicate and frail, others grow big and powerful. Despite these variances, the fact that a flower is a flower has a significance. Each flower is in a bloom. Each flower is absolutely unique when it is in bloom and fills the world with joy and beauty. When we consider the unique requirements of each flower, we discover that there is no one size fits all solution. If we treat each flower the same, some will drown under the weight of constant watering, others wither and fry in the scorching heat. But when we take the time to attend to each flower's specific demands, it may actually bloom and flourish. So, before we will tackle the child development and its importance, let us define first what is child development. So, what comes into your mind when you hear the word child development? Okay, this is which a child grows over time, so it covers the whole period of from the conception to an individual becoming fully functioning. It is a journey from total dependence to full independence. Child development involves the biological, psychological, and emotional changes that occur in human being between work and the conclusion of adolescence. So in childhood development, there are four stages in life which we will tackle that later. And over months, days, and years, or from the early childhood of the child until his or her old age, there is what we call developmental growth of a person. That is why it is crucial to observe and monitor his or her development. The developmental skills that must be mastered truly the same rate serve as guide for optimal to see if the child is developing in accordance with expectations. Thus, checking the milestone of a child help us to determine any difficulties at a particular stage. Giving intervention can also help in development of a child. Usually, the parents, teachers, and even pediatricians use the checklist to examine the child.
So next, let's proceed to the child development theories. So there are different child development theories, and during the early 20th century, interest in child development began, specifically that which focused on detecting abnormalities. Certain theories were discovered based on this interest to appreciate the growth that children experience from birth to adolescence. All of these theories will be discussed by Miss Angela.
Now let's proceed to psychosocial development theory of Erik Erikson. Now Erik Erikson was a German American psychologist who together with his wife Joanne became known for his work on psychosocial development. He was influenced by Sigmund and Anna Freud and became famous for coining the phrase identity crisis. Now, Erikson's theory of psychosocial development identifies 8 stages in which a healthy individual should pass through from birth to death. At each stages, we encounter different needs, ask new questions, and meet people who influence our behavior and learning. So the first stage is basic trust versus mistrust during infancy, ages 1 to 2 years old. So as infants, we ask ourselves if we can trust the world and we wonder if it is safe. We learn that if we can trust someone now, we can also trust others in the future. If we experience fear, we develop doubt and mistrust. The key to our development is our mother. The second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. During early childhood, ages 2 to 4 years old. In our early childhood, we experience ourselves and discover our body. We ask, is it okay to be me? If we are allowed to discover ourselves, then we develop self confidence. If we are not, we can develop shame and self doubt. Both parents now play a major role in our development. The third stage is initiative versus guilt during the preschool age 4 to 5 years old. So in preschool, we take initiative, try out new things, and learn basic principles like how round things roll. We ask, is it okay for me to do what I do? If we are encouraged, we can follow our interests. If we are held back, we can develop guilt. We are now learning from the entire family. Now, the fourth stage is the industry versus inferiority during the school age 5 to 12 years old. Now, we discover our own interest and realize that we are different from others. We want to show that we can do things right. We ask if we can make it in this world. If we receive recognition from our teachers or peers, we become industrious, which is another word for hardworking. If we get too much negative feedback, we start to feel inferior and lose motivation. Now, our neighbors and schools influence us the most. So, stage 5, identity versus role confusion. It is during adolescence from ages 13 to 19 years old. So during adolescence, we learn that we have different social roles. We are friends, students, children, and citizens. Many experience an identity crisis. If our parents not now allow us to go out and explore, we can find identity. If they push us to conform to their views, we can face role confusion and feel lost. Key to our learning are our peers and role models. Stage 6, intimacy versus isolation. It is during early adulthood from ages 20 to 40 years old. So as young adults, we slowly understand who we are and we start to let go of the relationships we had built earlier in order to fit in. We ask ourselves if we can love. If we can make a long term commitment, we are confident and happy. If we cannot form intimate relationships, we might end up feeling isolated and lonely. Our friends and partners are now centered to our development. Stage 7, generativity versus stagnation. It is during adulthood, 40 to 65 years old. When we reach our 40s, we become comfortable, use our leisure time creatively, and maybe begin contributing to society. Our concern is generativity. If we think that we are able to lead the next generation into this world, we are happy. If we did not resolve some conflicts earlier, we can become pessimistic and experience stagnation. People at home and at work are now who influence us most. The last stage is ego integrity versus despair during maturity from 65 years old until death. So as we grow older, we tend to slow down and begin to look back over our lives. We ask, how have I done? If we think we did well, we develop feelings of contentment and integrity. If not, we experience despair and become grumpy and bitter. Piaget's theory argues that we have to conquer four stages of cognitive development: the sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operational stage, and formal operational stage. The first stage is the sensory motor stage, which is ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop through experiences and movement of our five senses. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond our own body, and then as we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget terms, or realization of object permanence. After we understand that objects continue to exist even when we can't see them, we start becoming curious about everything. We want to smell flowers, taste food, listen to sounds, and talk to strangers. To explore more, we move, we learn to sit, crawl, stand, walk, and even to run. This increased physical mobility consequently leads to increased cognitive development, but we remain egocentric, meaning we can perceive the world only from our own point of view. The second stage is the pre-operational stage, which is from age 2 to 7. Our thinking is mainly categorized for symbolic functions and intuitive thoughts. We have lots of fantasies and believe objects are alive. We learn to speak and understand that words, images, and gestures are symbols from something else. When we draw our family, we are not concerned about drawing each person to scale, but rather with their symbolic meanings. At around age 4, most of us become very curious and ask many questions. We want to know everything. We call it the birth of primitive reasoning. Piaget calls it the intuitive age because we realize that we have a vast amount of knowledge, however, we have no idea how we acquired it. Our thinking in this stage is still pretty egocentric. We think others see the world like we do and still don't understand that they see it differently. The third stage is the concrete operational stage from ages 7 to 11. Now we finally discover logic and we develop concrete cognitive operations such as sorting objects in certain order. One example of this is inductive reasoning, which means that if we see someone eating a cookie, we can draw a conclusion and then make a generalization, and we now get the concept of conservation. We understand that if we pour orange juice from a normal glass to a taller one, the amount stays the same. We can now understand that if 3 plus 5 is equal to 8, then 8 minus 3 must equal to 5. Fourth stage is the formal operational stage from ages 12 and above. So once we become teenagers, we become formally operational. We now have the ability to think more rationally about abstract concepts and hypothetical events. Our advanced cognitive abilities allows us to understand abstract concepts such as success and failure, love and hate. We form deeper understanding of our own identity and our morality. Piaget believed in lifelong learning but insisted that the formal operational stage is the final stage of our cognitive development.
Good day, everyone. My name is John Isaac Mejorada, and I'll be continuing the discussion of the two remaining theories of child development. We already know about the psychosocial development theory. We already know the cognitive developmental theory. Now we will be discussing the sociocultural theory of Lev Vygotsky and the social learning theory of Albert Bandura. But first, let us discuss about the sociocultural theory of Lev Vygotsky. Now, in this theory, he believes that children learn actively through hands on experiences. He highlights the importance of other people, such as the parents, the caregivers, and the peers, in the development of the children. And interaction with other people allows learning to be integrated in the child's understanding of the world. Now, also included in this theory is what we call the zone of proximal development. It is where learning and development occurs. Now, what is this zone of proximal development? The first zone of proximal development is where a child can do things by themselves. For example, a toddler learning how to crawl. Now, those are the things that a child can do by themselves. Now, the next or the second part of the zone of proximal development is where a child can do things with the guidance or the help of other people. For example, again, the toddler may learn how to stand with the help of a parent or a caregiver. Now, those are the things that a child can do with the support of other people. Now, the next or the last one of zone of proximal development is where a child cannot do things even with the guidance of other people. For example, again, the toddler may drive a car. We can clearly tell that a child cannot drive a car. So those are the things that a child can't do even with the help of other people. Now that is the social cultural theory of Lev Vygotsky. Now let us move on to the next or the last theory of what we call the social learning theory of Albert Bandura. Now, in this theory, he believes that learning takes place through observation and modeling. As a child observes the actions of other people in his or her environment, new information is acquired and new skills are developed. Now, that is the theory of Albert Bandura. Now, for us to understand it more, in social learning theory, there is process of observational learning. Now, what are the parts of this process? There is attention, there is retention, there is motor production, and there is motivation. Now, in attention, a child focuses on the model's behavior or the things that the models did. Therefore, there is stimuli focus because the child is observing and the child is focusing on what the model is doing. Now, the next part of the process is what we call retention. Therefore, the child retains in her memory or his memory of what the model did. Therefore, there is rehearsal code of which the child has linked new information of what the model did. Now, the next one is the motor production or the practice feedback. Therefore, there is action or there is application of what the child have observed with the model. Therefore, they applied the things in their life of what they have observed with the model. Now, the last part of the process is what we call the motivation. It is where a child may realize that um, the things that they have observed or the things that they have applied is that it has value or it gives value, it gives insights to the child itself. So those are the parts or the processes of observational learning under the social learning theory. Now that would be all for the development theories of a child.
Good day, everyone. I am Jessica M. Torres. Here and now, let's proceed to typical and atypical development. That development of a child usually follows a predictable pattern. Most children will develop at the same rate and at about the same time as other children. The certain skills and abilities that are observed to gauge a child's development are called developmental milestones. Examples of these are sitting, bubbling, and following instructions. However, each child is unique. With this, not all reach a milestone at the same time. Thus, the terms typical and atypical development. Let us define the two terms first before we look further into what makes a child's development typical and atypical. The term typical development refers to the normal progression where children grow by acquiring knowledge, skills, and behavior called developmental milestones at a certain time frame. Smiling, crawling, manipulating objects, walking, self care, and talking are examples of developmental milestones that provide valuable insight into a child's development. On the other hand, atypical development is a term used when development does not follow the normal course. More so, a child is developing atypically when he or she reaches a milestone earlier or later than other children at his or her age. Atypical development can manifest in different ways, especially in children. There can be physical delays, such as delay in gross motor skills. There can be cognitive dysfunction, such as inability to focus attention. There can also be social or emotional manifestations, such as a lack of social skills or becoming easily frustrated. There is no clear way to identify if a child is developing typically or atypically. However, there are three commonly accepted principles of a child development that one should look into. The principles are as follows. Number one, rate of development differs among children. Not all children develop at the same rate, nor does any one children develop evenly in all areas. Number two, development occurs in a relatively orderly process. Development occurs in a relatively orderly sequence, with later abilities, skills, and knowledge building on those already acquired. The sequence in which children learn is more important than exactly when they reach milestones. Number three, development takes place gradually. Psychology emphasizes that development and changes in individuals occur gradually. One continuous development example occurs when examining children and mobility. As children grow up, they start crawling, then sitting, then standing, and finally walking. Now, let's proceed to the domains of development. The developmental milestones are categorized into four domains, namely physical, social and emotional, language, and cognitive. The physical domain refers to the development of physical changes such as size and strength. The development occurs in both gross and fine motor skills. The development of the senses and their uses are also part of the physical domain, which is influenced by illness and nutrition. A child's experience, expression, and management of emotions, along with the ability to establish positive relationships with others, refer to the social emotional domain. This includes both the intrapersonal and interpersonal processes that take place in a child. On the other hand, the language domain refers to the process of acquiring language in a consistent order without the need for explicit teaching from the environment. While construction of thought process, which includes remembering, problem solving, and decision making, refers to the cognitive domain.
Now, let's proceed to stages in child development. Stages, along with age, are used as ranges to mark significant periods in human development timeline. In each of these stages, growth and development occur in four domains. So by the way, there are four stages in child development. First is the infancy, which is from birth to 2 years old. Second is early childhood, from 3 years old to 8 years old. The middle childhood, from 9 to 11 years old. And last, the adolescence, from 12 years old to 18 years old. And now, let's tackle the first stage in child development, the infancy stage from birth to 2 years old of their age. So this is a critical stage in child development since in this the growth is rapid. Many believe that this stage is the most important stage in one's life since the changes that occur in infancy will affect the later stages of development. So this stage is also known as the building block for the succeeding stages in the attainment of crucial knowledge, skills, and behaviors. Let us take a look in the chart to see the typical and atypical developmental milestone in the infancy stage. There are four domains here: the physical, socio-emotional, language, and cognitive. So and in the second and third column, the typical and the atypical. So in physical domains and in typical, they hold without they holds their head without support. They can hold their head without support. They can they pushes legs down when feet are on flat surface. They roll over, sits without support, crawls, walks, and begins to run. While in atypical, the baby does not hold head up, does not put weight on legs, and cannot sit without support, and also does not walk steadily. In socio-emotional domains, as we all know, when they were a baby, they smiles at people. They likes to play, shy or afraid of strangers, cries when caregiver leaves, copies others, shows independence. While in atypical, their behavior is that they does not smile. They shows no affection and they does not recognize familiar people. In language domains, they makes and in typical their behavior is that they makes cooing and bubbling sounds, responds to own name. Like if we call them like baby, then they will respond to their because they know that sila ato ginatawag. Then makes different sounds, responds to simple requests, tries to say words like the first words like baba and papa. Then they say sentences. In atypical, their behavior is that they does not coo and babble. They does not say a single word, and as well as they does not speak in sentences. So here is the last domains of infancy stage, the cognitive domains. So in typical, their behavior is that they watches things as they move. They uses their eyes and hands together. They recognizes people at a distance. They transfers object from one hand to another and explores things in various ways. Uses things correctly like eats with a spoon. Like they know how to eat using spoon in this stage and that finds hidden things. In atypical, they does not watch things as they move and also they does not know what to do with the common objects.
Early childhood, which is from 3 to 8 years old, is a period of life with slow growth and rapid development. Most psychologists label this stage as the exploratory and questioning stage since the children enjoy discovering new things in their surroundings. A child's development may be typical or atypical. The term typical development refers to the normal progression where children grow by acquiring knowledge, skills, and behavior. Atypical development is a term used when development does not follow the normal course. Recall that the developmental milestones are categorized into four domains, namely physical, social and emotional, language, and cognitive. The first domain is the physical domain. It refers to the development of physical changes such as size and strength. Under the physical domain, a child is developing typically when he or she runs well, climbs easily, hops and stands on one foot, and can use toilet on his or her own. On the other hand, a child is developing atypically when he or she falls down often and needs help in physical activities. A child's experience, expression, and management of emotion, along with the ability to establish positive relationships with others, refers to the socio-emotional domain. Under the socio-emotional domain, a child is developing typically when he or she shows affection, takes turns in games, cooperates with other children, shows concern and sympathy, and shows more independence. A child is developing atypically when he or she does not want to play with others and is usually withdrawn. The language domain refers to the process of acquiring language in a consistent order without the need for explicit teaching from the environment. Under the language domain, a child is developing typically when he or she follows 2 to 3 step instructions, uses pronouns, tells and retells stories, and speaks clearly. When a child has unclear speech and can't tell stories accurately, he or she is developing atypically. Construction of thought process, which includes remembering, problem solving, and decision making, refers to the cognitive domain. In this domain, a child is developing typically when he or she plays make believe, works with simple toys, names colors and numbers, draws a person, names letters, as well as shows development of mental skills. When a child does not play with simple toys or make believe and loses skills once had, then the child is developing atypically.
Now let us move on to the next stage of child development, of which is the middle childhood. Now the age ranges from 9 to 11 years old. Now in middle childhood, in this stage, it brings various changes in a child's life. Now let us talk about the typical and atypical development during middle childhood. For the physical domain, the typical development of a child is that growth spurt may take place. They become more clumsy, and there is increase in appetite. Now that is for the typical development. The atypical development is that they may have limited mobility. For the social emotional domain, the typical development is that they form stronger friendships. They become more aware of body changes due to puberty. They show more concern about how they look, and they may feel stressed about schoolwork. Now, the atypical development is that they have difficulty making friends and keeping friends in their lives. Now, for the language domain, the typical development is that they continues to speak clearly. They express their thoughts articulately. Now, the atypical development is that they may have unclear speech and they can tell stories articulately. For the cognitive domain, there is increased in attention span and sees the view of other people more clearly. The atypical development on this domain may experience problems with comprehension and attention, and they may be unable to keep up with school's curriculum. Now that is for the middle childhood of or the stage of child development.
Now let's proceed to the final stage of child development, which is adolescence. It ranges from 12 to 18 years, and it is the period where puberty begins. By the end of this stage, most will have completed puberty. The child is now called a teen during this stage. The teen is becoming more vocal about his or her opinions due to the development of a unique personality. Peer pressure, however, will be present, which is why guidance from parents and guardians is very much needed. Now, let's proceed to the typical and atypical development during adolescence. In physical domain, the typical development of a child is he or she reaches adult weight and height, while in atypical development, the child has limited mobility. In socio-emotional domain, the typical developments of a child include he or she becomes interested in opposite sex, begins conflicts with parents, and shows more independence from parents. On the other hand, the typical development of a child may exhibit inappropriate behavior in public. In language domain, the typical developments of a child include continues to speak clearly and expresses one's thought articulately. On the other hand, the typical development of a child are he or she has unclear speech and can tell stories articulately. In cognitive domain, the typical developments of a child are he or she acquires and uses defined work habits and shows concern about the future. On the other hand, the atypical development of a child is when he or she is below grade level. Behaviors that are atypical should be observed keenly and recorded carefully. At times, the recorded observations might just be isolated events with no significant impact on later development. However, they might also be early warning signs of needs. The observed patterns will be useful to confirm if there is such a need. That's where our discussions, and I hope that you learned something new.